Alright, ladies and gentlemen, today we are doing the second day of the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. We just have one example to go over. Hopefully you went over it in enVision really quick just to kind of see the context. We're talking about a frog jumping off of a rock and to see how long it takes before it lands on the other side of the pond. And it gave us the function y equals negative 16t squared plus 10t plus 0.75, and the idea is this one's not factorable. We can't use the square roots to solve it. We don't want to use the completing the square because we're dealing with this a term of negative 16. So what we're going to use So what we're going to do is we're going to set this equal to 0, and we're going to use the quadratic formula. That was what we learned yesterday, the negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. We know here that our b is positive 10, our a is negative 16, and our c is this decimal 0.75. So I'm going to begin by plugging this in. X equals negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 10 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times 0.75 all over 2 times negative 16. Now, when I simplify that, I'm going to multiply this out here. 10 squared is 100, and then if I multiply negative 4 times negative 16 times 0.75, I get 48. So I end up with x equals negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 148 all over negative 32. When I find the square root of 148, that's not a perfect square, and in this instance, because we're talking about the number of seconds, we really don't want to have a square root in our answer. So I'm actually going to simplify this so that it is a decimal. So I'm going to take the square root of 148, and I want that to be a decimal, so I'm going to put my arrows at the end. And I get about 12.17 seconds. So I have negative 10 plus 12.17 all over negative 32. And I have negative 10 minus 12.17 all over negative 32. And when I simplify this in my calculator, I get about negative 0.06 and about 0.7. So I cannot have a negative amount of time. So the 0.7 is my answer. It takes the frog about 7/10 of a second to land on the other side. Okay? So, again, using the quadratic formula, that's pretty simple to plug into our calculator and get out this answer that tells us how long it takes the frog to get to the other side. Now, the last little bit of notes today is just kind of a summary of all of the examples of solving quadratic equations so far. The 5 methods that we have gone through are graphing, factoring, square roots, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. There's pros to all of them, but there's also cons to all of them. So the first method we learned was graphing, and the pro to graphing is that it's really good. It's a good visual to be able to see like where your zeros are. However, it's only helpful if you know what those are exactly. So the answers are not always exact. If we had to kind of estimate, we wouldn't be very good at it. And graphing is challenging. It takes a lot of time. We don't want to have to deal with that. Factoring is probably my favorite method. It's very simple to use. However, there's just some equations that are not factorable, and so it won't work all the time. Square roots are also, okay, I lied. Square roots is my favorite, but again, it only works when there's no bx term. So when b is equal to 0 is the only time it works. If I have something like x squared plus 2x plus 4, I can't use the square roots to solve it. I have to use factoring or a different method. Completing the square is another one. It's really nice to use completing the square when a is 1 and b is an even number, because then we're not dealing with decimals and fractions and we don't have to worry about dividing by that a value. But again, it's challenging. There's lots of steps, so there's a lot of room to make simple errors. And then the quadratic formula is great because it always works. No matter what the quadratic equation is, it will work as long as it's set equal to 0. But again, there's lots of steps. There's room to make sign errors because it's the negative b plus or minus, and then we have that minus 4ac, and just remembering to plug in negatives if you have to, and multiplying by negatives just makes it a little bit more challenging. So be very careful, but that's just kind of the summary of those 5 methods that we have learned so far.